Late one quiet night in a small-town hospital, a golden shepherd appeared out of nowhere, walking purposefully through the halls and stopping at the bedside of a dying boy. What happened next left the doctors questioning science, the family clinging to hope, and the staff believing in miracles. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming an emotion that you won't want to miss. The clock at Santa Clara Hospital read 2 in the morning. Most of the hallways were empty, and the steady hum of machines at the nurses' station seemed to be the only sign of life during the late shift. Clara, the head nurse, walked slowly, pushing the medication cart. Known for her sharp attention to detail, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off tonight. There was a strange tension in the air. A chill crept down her spine, even though the air conditioning was set at its usual temperature. As she checked the cardiac monitors in the recovery ward, a faint scratching sound near the main entrance caught her attention. Clara frowned. At this hour, the main doors were supposed to be locked tight. Who, or what, could it be? Intrigued, she turned and made her way down the hallway toward the sound. As she approached, a shadow appeared under the dim light outside. When she carefully opened the door, what she saw made her freeze. A large golden shepherd dog sat calmly under the beam of the streetlight. His deep, penetrating eyes seemed to study Clara, as if he could see right through her. He didn't look threatening, instead, he sat there like he belonged. "What are you doing here?" Clara murmured, knowing it was absurd to speak to a dog. Thor, that's what she instinctively decided to call him, didn't move. His stance was so solid that he seemed like a living statue. Clara felt a pang in her chest, a mix of curiosity and unease. For a fleeting moment, she thought about calling security to shoo him away, but something in her gut told her not to. Thor seemed to have a purpose. Minutes later, Daniel and Julia, Clara's colleagues, appeared in the hallway. Both wore puzzled expressions as they stared at the dog, as if he were some sort of apparition. "How did he get in?" Daniel asked, adjusting his glasses. "The doors are supposed to be locked, right?" "They were," Clara replied, unable to take her eyes off the dog. Julia took a hesitant step back, clearly unsettled. "We should get rid of him. We don't know where he came from." But before anyone could act, Thor stood up with deliberate grace and crossed the hospital's threshold. Clara felt the air around her shift, as if an invisible presence had entered along with the dog. Without hesitation, Thor began walking down the corridor with an unerring sense of direction. "He's heading for the pediatric wing," Clara murmured, disbelief thick in her voice. Daniel and Julia exchanged glances but decided to follow her, unable to ignore the bizarre situation. As they trailed Thor, Clara noticed the way he moved, with precision that felt almost otherworldly. The sound of his paws on the floor echoed through the silent hospital, not menacing but strangely comforting. When they reached the door to Gabriel's room, a 5-year-old boy who had been hospitalized for weeks with a rare, life-threatening illness, Thor stopped. He sat down again, his gaze fixed on the door as if waiting for someone or something. Clara felt her heart race. Thor was no ordinary dog, of that, she was certain. It was as if he knew more than anyone else in the room, as if he was connected to something far beyond her understanding. "What now?" Julia whispered. Clara didn't answer. Every instinct told her to watch, to let things unfold. Thor was here for a reason, and she knew this was only the beginning. The fluorescent lights hummed softly as Thor remained seated, his gaze locked on the door to Gabriel's room. Clara, standing a few feet away, felt the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her, while Julia clutched the clipboard she had been carrying, her knuckles white. "This isn't normal," Daniel muttered under his breath, adjusting his glasses again. "Why is he just sitting there?" Clara, however, couldn't bring herself to agree. Thor's calm yet focused demeanor gave her a strange sense of reassurance, even if she couldn't explain why. Before anyone could act, Thor rose to his feet. Without hesitation, he pushed the door open with his nose and stepped inside. "Wait!" Julia exclaimed, her voice loud in the otherwise silent hallway. Clara quickly raised a hand, gesturing for quiet. "Let's just see what happens," Clara whispered. Her voice carried a mixture of fear and awe. She followed Thor into the room, with Daniel and Julia trailing reluctantly behind her. Inside, the dim light of the machines cast a faint glow over Gabriel's small frame. The boy lay motionless under a pale blue blanket, his chest rising and falling in weak, shallow breaths. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound, a fragile reminder of the life still tethered to the boy's frail body. Thor walked forward with a deliberate slowness, his movements so quiet that even the slightest creak of the floor felt amplified in the room. He stopped beside the bed, lowering his head as if to inspect Gabriel. His deep, dark eyes seemed to soften, and for a moment, the only thing Clara could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. "What is he doing?" Julia whispered, standing near the door, clearly unnerved. Thor leaned closer, gently resting his muzzle on the edge of Gabriel's bed. Clara took a hesitant step forward, her medical instincts screaming at her to intervene, to protect the child from what was, after all, just an animal. But something stronger held her back. It was as if the air itself had shifted, growing heavy with anticipation. Then it happened. Gabriel's tiny hand, which had been limp for days, twitched. The movement was so slight that Clara initially thought she'd imagined it. But a second later, his fingers curled slightly, as though reaching for something. "Did you see that?" Daniel said, his voice breaking the silence. Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on Gabriel. Thor didn't move, his gaze steady and unwavering on the boy. Slowly, Gabriel's eyelids fluttered. His breaths deepened, and the pale color of his cheeks began to show a faint blush. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. It was impossible. Gabriel had been unresponsive for days, his condition deteriorating despite every medical effort. Gabriel's eyes opened fully now, their clarity sharp and bright, and the boy's gaze immediately found Thor. It was as if he recognized the dog. "Thor," the boy whispered weakly, his voice barely audible but filled with unmistakable certainty. Clara froze. How could he know the dog's name? She hadn't spoken it aloud, and no one in the room had mentioned it. A shiver ran down her spine as she watched Gabriel reach out, his hand trembling but determined, until his fingers brushed against Thor's golden fur. The moment Gabriel's hand made contact, a visible calm washed over the boy's face. His breathing steadied, the beeping on the monitor became rhythmic and strong, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled, a faint, fleeting expression of peace. Thor closed his eyes briefly, as if responding to the boy's touch. There was no aggression, no tension, only an overwhelming sense of connection between the child and the dog. Julia's clipboard clattered to the floor, snapping everyone out of their trance. This can't be real," Daniel stammered, his voice shaking. But Clara knew better. Whatever this was, it was beyond explanation, beyond anything she'd ever experienced. She felt tears sting her eyes as she watched the boy's frail body regain a strength that shouldn't have been possible. Thor had come here for a reason, one she couldn't yet comprehend. As the moment passed, Thor stepped back from the bed, his gaze briefly meeting Clara's. In his eyes, she saw something unspoken, something ancient and profound. It wasn't just a dog staring at her. It was as if Thor knew her thoughts, her fears, and even her questions. Then, with quiet steps, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving everyone frozen in stunned silence. Clara inhaled deeply, her hands trembling. "We need to check his vitals," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But deep down, she already knew. Gabriel was going to be okay. The small room felt alive in a way it hadn't in weeks. The soft glow from the heart monitor now pulsed with steady, rhythmic beeps, and Gabriel's breathing was deep and even. Clara couldn't take her eyes off the boy. She had spent countless nights checking on him, hoping for even the smallest sign of improvement. And now, out of nowhere, he seemed, well. Gabriel's small hand still rested where Thor's golden fur had been moments earlier. Clara exchanged glances with Daniel and Julia, both of whom looked as though they had seen a ghost. "Vitals first," Clara whispered, snapping into professional mode despite her shaking hands. She grabbed the boy's wrist gently, counting his pulse. It was strong, far stronger than it had been in days. Daniel moved to the monitor, scanning the readings with disbelief. "Heart rate's normal," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "And look at his oxygen levels, 98%. That's impossible. This doesn't make sense." Julia leaned against the doorframe, her face pale. "It has to be a coincidence," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "Doesn't it?" Gabriel's eyes fluttered open again, and this time, he turned his head slightly, looking directly at Clara. His lips moved, forming a word she couldn't quite hear. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Clara asked, leaning closer. "Thor," Gabriel repeated, a little louder now. His voice was still weak but filled with certainty. Clara felt her stomach drop. She had called the dog Thor, but only in her mind. No one had spoken the name aloud. She forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from Gabriel's forehead. "How do you know that name?" she asked softly. The boy's gaze wandered toward the door, where Thor had stood moments earlier. "He's my dog," Gabriel said simply. Julia let out a sharp gasp. "Your dog?" "That can't be," she started, but Clara silenced her with a sharp look. "What do you mean, Gabriel? Can you tell me more?" Clara asked, keeping her voice calm and steady. Gabriel's small hand clutched at the blanket as he spoke. "When I was little, Thor would sleep in my room. He was always there. But, he went away." "Went away?" Clara pressed gently. Her pulse was racing now, but she didn't want to scare him. The boy nodded. "Mommy said he went to heaven. But, he came back tonight. I saw him. He made me feel better." Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. This wasn't just strange, it was impossible. Julia turned her back, muttering something under her breath, while Daniel paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "This isn't real," Daniel said, shaking his head. "Dogs don't just come back. And even if they did, how could he fix this? It's not scientific." "Does it matter?" Clara snapped, her voice firm. "Look at him, Daniel. He's better. That's all that matters." The door creaked open, and Gabriel's parents entered, their faces lined with exhaustion. Clara stepped aside to let them through, watching as their expressions shifted from worry to shock when they saw their son sitting up, his face brighter than it had been in weeks. "Gabriel," his mother whispered, rushing to his side. She cupped his face in her hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're awake. You're okay." "Thor made me better," Gabriel said simply, his small voice cutting through the emotion in the room. "Thor," his father repeated, glancing at Clara in confusion. Clara hesitated. How could she possibly explain? "A dog," she said finally. "A golden shepherd. He appeared here tonight, and something happened." The color drained from Gabriel's mother's face. She gripped the edge of the bed as if to steady herself. "Thor," she repeated, her voice trembling. "Are you sure?" "Yes, Mommy. It was Thor. He came back," Gabriel said with absolute conviction. His father looked equally bewildered. "But Thor. He's been gone for months. He died. How could he?" Gabriel's mother cut him off, her hand tightening on his arm. "Thor always protected Gabriel," she whispered. Even when I was pregnant, he would lie next to me, like he was keeping watch. And when Gabriel was born, he never left his side. Clara listened in stunned silence, her mind racing. The pieces didn't fit together, but there was no denying the connection between Gabriel and the mysterious dog. Thor had come to the hospital for a reason, of that she was certain. As Gabriel drifted back to sleep, his breathing steady and peaceful, his mother turned to Clara, tears streaming down her face. "You said the dog was here. Where is he now?" Clara glanced toward the hallway, where Thor had disappeared. "He left," she said quietly. "But I think he'll be back." The room fell into a heavy silence as everyone grappled with what had just happened. Clara's gaze lingered on Gabriel, now resting more comfortably than he had in weeks. Whatever Thor's presence meant, one thing was clear: this wasn't over. The tension in Gabriel's room was palpable, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the machines and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Clara stood near the doorway, watching Gabriel's parents as they hovered close to their son, their emotions teetering between joy and disbelief. His mother, Mariana, couldn't stop stroking his hair, while his father, Lucas, sat stiffly in the chair by the bed, his brows furrowed in thought. Clara finally broke the silence. "I need to ask you something," she began cautiously. "Gabriel said the dog, Thor, was his. He said Thor came back tonight to help him. Can you tell me more about Thor?" Mariana's hand froze mid-motion, her eyes clouding with fresh tears. "Thor was our dog," she said quietly. "He was a golden shepherd. We got him before Gabriel was born, and he was special." Lucas nodded slowly, his expression grim. "Thor wasn't just a dog. He had this way of sensing things. He was always by Gabriel's side, especially when he was sick. But he's gone now." Clara stepped closer, her curiosity overwhelming her hesitation. "What happened to him?" Mariana glanced at Lucas before answering, her voice trembling. "Thor passed away a few months ago. Right before Gabriel got really sick. He had stopped eating, stopped moving around much. It was like he knew something was going to happen. One morning, we found him lying under Gabriel's bed. He was just gone." The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. Julia, who had been lingering near the doorway, gasped softly, while Daniel stood frozen, his expression unreadable. Clara felt a chill run through her. Thor's sudden appearance at the hospital wasn't just a coincidence, it couldn't be. "I know this sounds strange," she said hesitantly, "but the dog I saw tonight, the one Gabriel called Thor, he acted like he belonged here. Like he knew exactly where to go." Mariana covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You're sure? You're sure it was a golden shepherd?" Clara nodded. "I'm sure. He walked straight to Gabriel's room and, it was like he brought him back to life." Lucas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and rubbed his temples. "This doesn't make sense. Thor is buried in our backyard. How could he be here?" Before Clara could respond, Gabriel stirred in his bed. His small voice broke through the tension. "Mommy, Thor said it's okay now. He said I'm going to be fine." The room fell silent again. Mariana turned to her son, tears spilling over. "Gabriel, did you really see Thor?" Gabriel nodded, his eyes bright with certainty. "He was here. He looked at me, and I wasn't scared anymore. He told me he came to help." Daniel took a shaky step forward, his voice laced with skepticism. "Clara, it's impossible. Maybe the boy is confused, or it's his imagination. Dogs don't just come back from the dead." Clara didn't look at Daniel. She couldn't tear her gaze away from Gabriel, whose calm and steady presence was impossible to ignore. "I don't know how or why, but I know what I saw," she said firmly. "Thor was here, and he did something no one else could." Julia cleared her throat, her voice shaky. What if it really was him? I mean, some things don't need to make sense. Lucas stood abruptly, his face a mask of frustration and confusion. We need answers. I can't just believe that this is Thor. He's gone. He's been gone for months. Mariana touched his arm, her voice soft but steady. Lucas, maybe we don't need answers. Maybe it's enough that Gabriel is better. Clara took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes things happen that science can't explain. I've seen a lot in this hospital, but nothing like this. Whatever Thor's presence meant, it helped Gabriel. That's what matters. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, still visibly struggling with the situation. Mariana, on the other hand, seemed to embrace it. She kissed Gabriel's forehead and whispered, "Thank you, Thor," as if the dog could hear her. As Clara prepared to leave the room, Julia pulled her aside. "Clara," she whispered, glancing back at Gabriel and his parents, "what do we do with this? I mean, this isn't something we can just forget." "We don't forget," Clara replied softly. "We accept it. Thor was here for a reason, and we have to trust that." Julia hesitated but finally nodded. "You really believe it was him, don't you?" Clara looked down the hallway, where Thor had vanished into the shadows hours earlier. "I don't just believe it," she said. "I know it." The hospital corridors were quieter than usual as the night dragged on, but the tension in Clara's chest hadn't subsided. Back at the nurse's station, she stared at Gabriel's vitals displayed on the monitor, her mind replaying every detail of Thor's appearance. Daniel and Julia sat nearby, equally uneasy, their faces a mixture of disbelief and lingering fear. "Are you going to tell anyone about this?" Julia asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Clara hesitated, gripping the edge of the counter. "What would I even say? That a dog, one that shouldn't even exist, walked into a hospital and healed a dying boy? They'd think I've lost it." Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe that's the problem. It's easier to pretend this didn't happen. But Clara, you saw him. We all did. And Gabriel's parents?" Julia added. "They know what they saw too. We can't ignore this." Clara looked down at her trembling hands. "Ignoring it doesn't change the truth. Thor came here for Gabriel. And I think he came for all of us too." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Julia shifted in her chair but didn't argue. Daniel, ever the skeptic, leaned back and crossed his arms. "If that's true, then why isn't he still here? Why didn't he stay?" Before Clara could respond, the steady beep of Gabriel's monitor caught their attention. It had quickened slightly, not in a way that indicated distress, but enough to draw their focus. Clara rushed to the room, Daniel and Julia close behind her. Gabriel was awake, sitting up in bed. His small face was flushed, not with fever, but with a newfound energy that seemed impossible for a child who had been so weak. His mother, Mariana, was perched on the edge of his bed, tears of relief streaming down her face. Lucas stood nearby, still processing the surreal scene. "Clara!" Gabriel called out as she entered the room. His voice was brighter, stronger than it had been in weeks. "Thor's still here." Clara froze in place, her pulse racing. "He's here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel nodded eagerly, pointing toward the door. "I saw him. He looked at me and smiled. Then he walked outside." Mariana turned to Clara, her expression equal parts astonished and hopeful. "He's getting better, Clara. Look at him." Clara approached the bed and checked Gabriel's pulse. It was strong and steady. She glanced at the monitor, which confirmed what she already knew: Gabriel's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. "This shouldn't be possible," Daniel muttered from behind her, his eyes glued to the screen. Does it matter? Julia shot back, her voice firm. Look at him. He's alive. He's healthy. Gabriel tugged at Clara's sleeve, drawing her attention. Thor told me he had a job to do, he said earnestly. He said he came back to help me and that everything's going to be okay now. Clara knelt beside him, her voice soft. Did he say anything else, Gabriel? The boy shook his head. No, but I know he's happy. He's not worried about me anymore. Clara blinked back tears as she ruffled Gabriel's hair. She wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. But the logical part of her mind still struggled to process what she'd witnessed. As she stepped back, her gaze fell to the window. The faint outline of the hospital's courtyard was visible under the moonlight, and for a moment, she thought she saw a golden shape moving through the shadows. Her breath caught, but when she blinked, it was gone. Back at the nurse's station, Clara sat in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Daniel and Julia joined her, equally subdued. I think Thor knew, Clara said finally, her voice breaking the stillness. He knew Gabriel would get better. That's why he left. But why come in the first place? Daniel asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Why not let things play out naturally? Because sometimes, Julia interjected, we need more than science. We need faith. Clara nodded slowly, her gaze distant. Thor wasn't just here for Gabriel. He was here for all of us. To remind us that some things are bigger than logic. Bigger than medicine. For the first time in hours, Daniel didn't argue. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, his skepticism replaced by quiet acceptance. As the night wore on, Clara found herself wandering the halls, her thoughts consumed by Thor's visit. When she reached Gabriel's room again, she paused in the doorway. Inside, the boy was fast asleep, his breathing steady, his mother curled protectively at his side. The sight filled Clara with a profound sense of peace. Before she turned to leave, her gaze drifted to the courtyard again. The moonlight glinted off something golden near the tree line. This time, Clara didn't blink. She simply watched, a soft smile spreading across her face. Thank you, she whispered, her words meant for Thor, wherever he was. The first rays of dawn began creeping through the hospital windows, casting long, pale shadows along the corridors. The night had been like no other, and Clara felt its weight pressing down on her as she made her rounds. The world outside continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but inside, everything felt irrevocably changed. Gabriel was better. His condition had shifted from critical to stable within hours, something none of the medical staff could rationalize. Yet, Clara knew the reason, even if it defied logic. Thor had come, and his presence had changed everything. In the quiet of the pediatric ward, Clara found herself back in Gabriel's room. The boy was sitting up now, playing with a set of colorful blocks his mother had brought. His cheeks glowed with a healthy pink, and his laughter filled the room like sunlight breaking through a storm. Clara, he called, beaming as she entered. Do you want to see what I made? Clara smiled, walking over to him. Of course, Gabriel. Show me. He proudly displayed a small tower of blocks. It was uneven and wobbly, but it stood tall. Thor would like this, don't you think? Clara's smile faltered for a moment. I think he would love it, she said softly, her throat tightening. Mariana, sitting by Gabriel's bedside, reached out to Clara, her hand trembling. How can we ever thank you? I don't even know how to process any of this. You don't need to thank me, Clara replied, glancing briefly at the window. Thor did what none of us could. Mariana nodded, her eyes glistening. Do you think he'll come back? Clara hesitated. She didn't want to give false hope, but deep down, she felt that Thor had finished what he came to do. I think he's watching over Gabriel, no matter where he is," she said, her voice steady but gentle. Later that morning, Clara, Daniel, and Julia gathered in the staff lounge, the events of the night still weighing heavily on their minds. Daniel leaned against the counter, a cup of coffee untouched in his hand. "Do you think it's over?" he asked, his voice subdued. Clara shrugged. "Thor came for Gabriel. He did what he needed to do. I think that's enough." "But why?" Daniel pressed. "Why him? Why now? Does it matter?" Julia interjected. "We saw something incredible. We may never understand it, but maybe we're not supposed to." Clara nodded, her gaze distant. "Thor gave us more than a miracle. He reminded us that there's more to this life than what we can measure or explain." The room fell silent, each of them lost in thought. For Daniel, the experience had shaken his reliance on logic and science. Julia, who had always been open to the unknown, felt a renewed sense of wonder. And for Clara, it was something deeper, a quiet acceptance that not everything needed answers. By the afternoon, Gabriel's improvement was the talk of the hospital. Nurses whispered in the hallways, and doctors studied his charts with furrowed brows. Yet, no one could explain the sudden turnaround. Clara avoided the conversations, knowing that even if she tried, no explanation would suffice. Before her shift ended, Clara decided to visit the hospital courtyard. The cool breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the sterile air inside. She walked slowly, her footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path, until she reached the edge of the tree line where she thought she'd seen Thor the night before. Clara paused, scanning the area. It was quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and distant chirping birds. For a moment, she felt foolish. Perhaps she'd only imagined seeing him. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. In the dirt near the base of an old oak tree were paw prints. Large, unmistakable paw prints. Clara knelt down, her fingers brushing lightly against the marks. The prints led away from the tree, disappearing into the undergrowth. "Goodbye, Thor," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "Thank you." A warmth filled her chest, not unlike the feeling she'd had when Thor first appeared. It wasn't sadness, it was peace. Back inside, Clara stopped by Gabriel's room one last time before heading home. The boy was asleep, his mother sitting quietly beside him, stroking his hair. Mariana looked up and smiled. "He's dreaming," she said. "I think he's dreaming about Thor." Clara smiled back, her heart full. "Maybe he is." As she left the hospital, the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything. Clara walked to her car, her thoughts lingering on Thor and the unexplainable events of the night before. She felt a sense of closure, though she knew she would carry the memory of Thor with her forever. Days turned into weeks, and the events of that extraordinary night slowly faded from the hospital's daily routine. But for those who had witnessed Thor's presence, Clara, Gabriel, and his family, nothing would ever be the same. Gabriel was discharged from the hospital within days, his strength and health returning with remarkable speed. Doctors reviewed his case obsessively, but no medical explanation emerged for his sudden turnaround. At home, Gabriel often spoke about Thor, recounting vivid dreams where the golden shepherd played with him in sprawling fields. "He's still watching me," Gabriel would tell Mariana with the certainty only a child could possess. Mariana and Lucas, though deeply grateful, struggled to reconcile the miracle they had witnessed. "How do you explain something like this?" Lucas asked one evening as they sat in the living room, watching Gabriel play on the carpet. Mariana shook her head, a soft smile on her lips. "You don't," she said simply. "You hold on to it. You thank him, wherever he is." They placed a photo of Thor on the mantel, a quiet tribute to the dog who had returned from the beyond to save their son. Every morning, Gabriel would stop and whisper, "Thank you, Thor," before heading off to play. Clara found herself spending more time walking the hospital grounds, often pausing at the oak tree where she had found Thor's paw prints. She couldn't shake the feeling that his presence had changed her in ways she couldn't fully understand. One evening, during a quiet moment in the staff lounge, Julia joined her with 2 cups of coffee. "You still thinking about him?" Julia asked, handing Clara a cup. "Every day," Clara admitted, staring into the dark liquid. "It's like, he didn't just help Gabriel. He helped me too." "How so?" Julia asked, genuinely curious. Clara sighed. "I've spent so many years trusting only what I can see, what I can prove. Thor reminded me that there's more out there, things we can't measure, things we're not meant to explain." Julia smiled softly. "Maybe that's enough, then. Knowing there's more." Clara nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. She no longer needed answers. She had witnessed something miraculous, and that was enough. For Daniel, the skeptic among them, the experience lingered in his mind like a persistent riddle. He spent hours reading articles about canine behavior and spiritual phenomena, searching for a rational explanation. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that not everything had a neat answer. One night, as he walked past Gabriel's old room, Daniel paused. The room was now occupied by another child, the sounds of quiet machines filling the air. For a moment, he swore he heard the soft padding of paws echoing down the hallway, but when he turned, there was nothing there. He chuckled to himself, shaking his head. "All right, Thor," he whispered. "You win." 1 month after Gabriel's discharge, Mariana returned to the hospital with a bouquet of flowers. She handed them to Clara at the nurse's station, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "These are for you," Mariana said. "For everything you did." Clara accepted the flowers with a smile. "I didn't do much," she said. "Thor did." Mariana nodded. "He did. But you were there. You believed." As Mariana turned to leave, Gabriel tugged on her hand and pointed toward the courtyard. "Mommy, look," he exclaimed. Mariana and Clara followed his gaze. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was a golden shape. It was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakable. Thor stood watching them, his dark eyes filled with calm and wisdom. Clara's breath caught in her throat as Gabriel waved enthusiastically. "Bye, Thor." "Thank you," the boy called out. Thor tilted his head, his tail wagging once before he turned and disappeared into the trees. For a long moment, no one spoke. Mariana knelt beside Gabriel, tears streaming down her face. "Do you think he'll come back again?" she asked softly. Clara shook her head, a bittersweet smile on her lips. "I don't think he needs to. He knows you're all okay now." Gabriel grinned, his face filled with the boundless hope of a child. "He'll always be my friend." As time passed, Thor's visit became less of a story and more of a quiet memory for those who had witnessed it. Gabriel grew stronger, his laughter filling the house with life again. Mariana and Lucas often found themselves looking at Thor's photo, feeling a deep sense of gratitude that words could never capture. At the hospital, Clara continued her work with renewed purpose. Every time she passed the oak tree or stepped into Gabriel's old room, she felt a quiet presence, a reminder that some miracles were meant to be accepted, not explained. And though Thor had vanished from their sight, his impact remained, etched into their hearts as a symbol of love, loyalty, and the inexplicable forces that sometimes intervene when we need them most. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.